From Dutch cannon and thundering broadsides, Monmouth, now well-blooded in combat, returned to England. But it was not a land fit to welcome conquering heroes. It was a land of plague and pestilence. The country had suffered another hard, bleak winter of 1664-5, and this was followed by a particularly hot, stifling and unrelenting summer. Where the filth lay thickest, in the overcrowded and cramped cities, the pestilence struck hardest. In May 1665, London recorded 43 dead from plague. In June, 600. In July, 5,000. Fear was contagious, even to the highest in the land, and by the end of July, the royal court had moved to the safer surroundings of Hampton Court. Samuel Pepys, as always, was on hand. He wrote, "Sad news of so many in the parish of the plague. 40 last night. The bells are always going." Even Monmouth and the royal family would have been paralysed with fear. This unseen terror could strike anyone, anywhere. They would hear the continuous bells, the cries of "Bring out your dead," and hear tragic descriptions of doors daubed with blood-red crosses. The towns and cities of England would have been visions of hell. Yet Hampton Court would not seem safe enough, and so the royal household were on the move again. King, Queen, Lady Castlemaine, Monmouth and Anne drove to Salisbury, then in September via Wimborne to disease-free Oxford. It was here that the newlyweds split, with Monmouth travelling to Althorpe near Northampton, to the house of one Lord Sunderland. Sunderland, who 20 years later would use Monmouth and then betray him. It was a continual time of movement for the young Duke, as he moved to Hitchingbrook, and then spent Christmas with his former guardian, the Crofts, at Saxham Hall in Suffolk. During this time, Monmouth apparently stayed with Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, at his country home in Windbone, St Giles. This man would be a political thorn in the king's side for years to come, and also be a key player in Monmouth's eventual downfall. Yet fear of the plague slowly subsided as the chill air of autumn and winter blew over England. But there was a greater fear approaching, a terror even, a terror which was intangible and could mean the very end of the world. For the year 1666 was upon them. 666, the year of the beast. What new horrors awaited man? They had already had a plague the year before. Would the horizon soon be blackened by an image of the horseman of the apocalypse? Well, the early months of the new year passed without much comment. A few areas reported plague, but no serious outbreak unlike the year before. But then, 2nd of September came around, and attention would soon be upon a narrow alley in London called Pudding Lane. Much has been discussed about the causes and potential culprits of the Fire of London. Was it a catastrophe waiting to happen, with the crowded alleys, tinder-dry buildings, and a very hot summer? Or was it an act of terrorism by the Dutch, or even the French? One thing is certain, that as the fire became an inferno, the Mayor of London certainly does not deserve any laurels. On hearing of a fire having started, he is recorded to have said, "'Tis nothing, a housemaid could piss it out." But the fire was a time for heroes, and from an unexpected quarter. Amidst the roaring fires, the billowing ash and choking smoke, was the King, the Duke of York, and our hero, the Duke of Monmouth. They could all three have escaped the capital, left the inhabitants to their devices, but no, they rolled up their sleeves, and riding and walking up and down rows of workmen, they encouraged and cajoled work parties to fight the fires. They rewarded with bags of money when possible, and threatened with regal vigour when necessary. They were seen ankle deep in water, passing buckets surrounded by hissing sparks and falling masonry, and ensuring orders for blowing up houses were carried out. Even after the fire subsided, the king and son were a welcome sight, being seen on horseback or foot, visiting the ashen ruins twice a day, giving directions and assisting in repairs and rebuilding. There is a character which is worth mentioning now, a character who also assisted during the Great Fire, a character who will come and go in Charles II's and Monmouth's life, but more importantly, will find himself on the opposite side of a battlefield to the Duke of Monmouth. A battlefield that will lead to Monmouth's eventual defeat and ultimately his grisly death. This man was Louis de Rye, the future Earl of Feversham. He would rise in rank in the army like Monmouth, and even serve near each other at the Siege of Maastricht. During the Great Fire, Feversham was another nobleman who stayed in the capital to fight the flames. During the blaze, he was struck on the head by falling timbers. The effect on him was to be a source of useful propaganda after the Battle of Sedgemoor in 1685. Pepys' diary flows effortlessly from reporting on the king and his son battling through the ash and embers of a charred city to the polished marble of the royal court. He wrote, "I also to the ball, and with much ado got up to the loft, where with much trouble I could see very well. It was indeed a glorious sight to see Mrs. Stuart in black and white lace, her head and shoulders dressed in diamonds." He continues, "I can remember presently were the King, the Duke of York, Prince Rupert, Duke of Monmouth, Duke of Buckingham, Lord Douglas, Colonel Russell." Monmouth's courtly life was soon to be given its highest honour in December, when he, along with the Earl of Manchester, were made Fellows of the Garter Knights. He looked resplendent in a long blue velvet coat and a tall, highly crowned ostrich plume hat. He loved his costume so much that day that in April the following year he wore it again, when he went out gallivanting and roystering with Lord Oxford. He wore them all day and night, rode in the park and travelled in a hackney carriage with 2 footmen. Behaving in this manner was seen as a most scandalous thing, and commentators were at a loss to describe the gravity of their behaviour. But perhaps this larking hid more serious affairs, for despite the appearance of peace and tranquillity in Charles's Restoration Britain, the clouds of war were not far away. The Dutch were still the principal enemy, and a close watch on their movements was constantly needed. Monmouth was slowly growing in his military roles, and Lord Oxford was a senior commander in the army, colonel of the Royal Regiment of Horse. He was also in command of the Essex Militia, the exact county where Monmouth had his own troops on coastal watch. So perhaps the larking about in their gaudy finery hid more serious considerations, potential courses open to an enemy. The men had every right to be concerned and be wary of a dangerous foe, for the Dutch were not led by any old admiral. At the head of their fleet was Admiral de Ruyter, a seasoned veteran who demanded respect from friend and foe. But on top of this, keeping to an old treaty, Louis XIV of France, spying a chance to snap up some colonies in the West Indies, declared war on England as well. The first engagement between these two great fleets was the so-called 4 Days' Battle in June 1666, where the Dutch gave the English fleet a battering. The English lost about 20 ships as well as 5,000 casualties, 1,000 of these killed, including Vice Admiral Mings and Berkeley. On top of this, nearly 2,000 were taken prisoner, including Vice Admiral Eskew. The Dutch suffered, but not nearly as much. 4 ships sunk and 2,000 men killed or wounded. But like the English, they suffered a high proportion of losses in admirals, including Admiral Evertson, Admiral van der Hulst, and Rear Admiral Stackover. Despite the numerical victory over the English, the defeated ships were able to retire and then beat off an attack by the pursuing Dutch when they were at anchor in the Thames estuary, an attempt that would come back to haunt the English all too soon. But the Navy and its administration and dockyards managed a miraculous turnaround. For after a lightning refit and recruitment drive, the end of July saw the English at sea once more and seeking battle with the Dutch. This time, at St. James' Day Battle, the result was reversed, and the leaders of the English fleet were heroes from the English Civil Wars, George Monk and Prince Rupert. I know, surprising, isn't it? The enemy, as before, was de Ruyter. After a murderous fight, the English were victorious, having inflicted roughly 1,200 casualties on the Dutch for about 300 of their own. The Dutch lost 2 ships, the Sneak and the Tholen, yet the English could not use these to their advantage, and ending up burning them. Now, just as the result was reversed from the last battle, so was the follow-up. The English under Rear Admiral Holmes decided that a normal blockade of a Dutch port was not economically viable and more extreme measures were needed. They chose to attack a Dutch port and bring to it sword and flame. Holmes reported to Monk that he had destroyed 150 ships, captured the ADLR of 12 cannon, and destroyed the shelling. More reports came in including smoke was seen rising from several places in the island of Blythe, and the 10th brought news that Sir Robert had burned in the enemy's harbour 160 outward bound valuable merchantmen and 3 men of war, and taken a little pleasure boat and 8 guns in 4 hours. The loss is computed at £1 million sterling, and will make great confusion when the people see themselves in the power of the English at their very doors. Sir Robert then landed his forces and is burning the houses in Blythe and shelling as bonfires for his good success at sea. This attack, named Holmes's Bonfire, put heart into the English navy, but would make them and the government overly confident. They should have known better, for the Dutch were soon out for revenge on a grand scale and aimed at the very heart of England. With the benefit of hindsight, it is perhaps too easy to see a disaster looming. The King, Parliament and Monmouth had constant reports of Dutch activity from across the North Sea, and yet, as so often happens in Britain's history, Parliament failed to support the war effort. Ships were laid up, sailors discharged, stores allowed to rot, and coastal defences were neglected. The army, for what it was also badly in need of recruitment and investment. It was hardly a force that could be used in a continental war. There was the Life Guard of Horse of 500 men, Lord Oxford's Regiment of Horse, 500 men, the King's Regiment of Foot, 1,200 men, and the Coldstream Regiment of Foot Guards, another 1,000 men. On top of this embryo of an army, there was a smattering of militias and badly equipped static garrison companies. The King, despite the reduction in funding for the army and navy, sent out a series of instructions to local garrisons to bolster what defences there were. Coastal garrisons were instructed to make greatest show they could in numbers, more especially of horse, even though it be of such as are wholly unfit, horse being the force that most discouraged the enemy from landing. The King then went on to commission 9 independent auxiliary cavalry troops. One of these 9 would be commanded by his beloved son, James, Duke of Monmouth. Part of the commission for Monmouth read, "And hearing that the Dutch have 7,000 to 8,000 men in their fleet now on our coasts, wishes to raise distinct troops of horse, to be afterwards incorporated in regiments, and send James, Duke of Monmouth, a commission of raising 80 horse." It might seem incredible to our modern eyes that a lad of 17, with minimal active service, was given a command so early in his life. But the men under Monmouth's command did not see it like this. They saw it as an honour, even though several could be old enough to be his father. They would be glad to serve under the King's most beloved son. Monmouth would prove himself quick-witted, strong and athletic. He could handle a sword and pistol, and was one of the best riders his men had met. With his upbringing since his father's restoration, he had been surrounded by a set hierarchy and order. Men knew their place, and Monmouth had seen at court and in the navy how men gave orders and how men reacted to them. He was to all accounts a natural leader of men. The fact that he had performed heroics alongside the Duke of York, whilst cannons thundered and roared, was only a help in him gaining confidence from his men. But who were these men of Monmouth's first command? They would be wealthy noblemen of independent means, with enough funds to provide a couple of horses, clothe and arm themselves without any expense to the King. They would probably not have looked too much like a well-drilled military unit, but a loose gaggle of cavaliers. They would have been adorned with broad-brim hats, richly coloured breeches, buff coats, thigh boots, and leather gauntlets. They would have been well armed with pistols in their saddle holsters, as well as a sword at their waist. But no matter how dashing and adventurous these young blades must have looked, not everyone was convinced of their effectiveness. Samuel Pepys again. At Harwich there is the Duke of Monmouth, and with him a great many young Hectors, but to little purpose, I fear but to debauch the countrywomen thereabouts. And yet, despite Pepys's concerns, it would appear that the young aspiring military man was taking his new role seriously. He reported to his father the king from his command post. For an early report, it is upbeat, enthusiastic, and shows that Monmouth had been in conference with other commanders. He wrote, "The place is in a very good posture, and as desirous of an attack from the Dutch as the latter are unwilling to hazard it. Their whole fleet, except 6, has gone towards the river, and Sir Henry Appleton writes that they have plundered Canvey Island. Many small boats attend them for that purpose. I think they mean little else than to steal sheep, which they attempted at St. Osoph, but retired when the people appeared. The militia are very ready and cheerful for service." But events would rapidly take a grim turn as more and more reports came in. The situation was becoming more serious and more complicated. Monmouth now received word from Arlington that the king wanted him to muster his forces and then join with Prince Rupert's regiment of horse. On the very same day, Silas Taylor was writing to the Under-Secretary. 3 vessels have sailed hence. It is said to try and cut the buoys of the gun fleet. Guns were heard with great fury all day. God preserve Chatham. The Duke of Monmouth rode thence last night with those that attend him, labouring to get to Gravesend. Last evening, 30 of the Dutch fleet were seen coming down to the gun fleet. This report was the first inkling of what was to become known as the Dutch raid on the Medway. This raid, which Monmouth would have seen, heard and stood powerless against, was a national humiliation for the English, it being one of the worst disasters ever to be suffered in English naval history. The English were unprepared, their fleet being in a much reduced state due to a squeeze of the budgets. Many of the big ships were laid up and their crews demobilised. The Dutch saw their chance for a thundering victory and how to increase their bargaining position in any ongoing peace talks. The Dutch attack was under the command of the nemesis of the English fleet, Admiral de Ruyter. The Dutch broke through the poorly maintained defensive chain, and despite the cannon fire from Upnor Castle, they advanced. Having entered the River Medway, they burned a number of ships, many unmanned and unable to return fire. The English were so panicked that they sank around 30 of their largest ships. This did not stop the Dutch running wild. They then captured the fort at Sheerness. It was a battle that set a river on fire, causing panic across London. Local inhabitants would have smelt the whiff of gun smoke, burning timber, pitch and tar. Warships were ablaze, flames shooting through gun ports. The smoke was visible for miles along the North Kentish coastline. But humiliating most of all was the Dutch towing away not only a warship, but the Royal Charles, the flagship of the fleet. It was a total humiliation to a proud seafaring nation and to the king. But how were the Dutch able to navigate these treacherous waters so well? How could they sail with almost impunity from attack from the land? How did they know what ships were manned and unmanned? I am afraid that once again the fault can be laid at the king's feet. Due to cutbacks and the fleet being reduced to the expenditure of war, many sailors, after having risked life and limb for their country, were cast out. Feeling betrayed and wanting revenge, many sailors and pilots, like dissenter Robert Holland, defected to the Dutch. Their intimate knowledge of shoals, currents, tides, and the routines of the fleet were invaluable to the attacking Dutch. The fallout to this attack again was centred on the Crown and the royal court, and, in a way, towards Monmouth. The mob were incensed and blamed the Dutch raid, the plague, and the fire of London, 3 tragedies in 3 years, as God's retribution on a dissolute court and the vices of the king and those about him. But as you may imagine, these slurs would slide off the king's slippery countenance. Whilst Monmouth was riding by night fighting fires, marshalling troops, and reporting to his superiors, the king, his father, was at play. The king was in the company of his mistress, Lady Castlemaine. Samuel Pepys, who else, paints the picture. The night the Dutch burned our ships, the king did sup with my Lady Castlemaine at the Duchess of Monmouth's, and they were all mad in hunting a poor moth. It would seem the hero king that had handled buckets of water while the great fire roared all about him had changed. If you missed our previous episode on the young James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, and his baptism of fire aboard a Royal Navy warship, click here or follow the links in the description box below. In our next episode, James, Duke of Monmouth, King's favourite, becomes a pawn in the seedy world of international diplomacy and the scandalous details of the secret Treaty of Dover. As always, thanks for watching.